Well, it would appear over a century-long mystery has been solved, so they say, or so I've been told. And that is, well, Jack the Ripper's identity has been discovered, or at least that's the current claim at the moment. And if you're not aware of who Jack the Ripper is, he is probably the most infamous serial killer, because he had 5 distinct murders, which we'll get into later. And so he's also dubbed the Whitechapel murder because that is the area which it happened. And all the confirmed victims of him were all prostitutes or night workers, is what it is. So just to give a brief summary of the case that we're going to get into. So it just goes by that apparently a new forensic study points to someone named Aaron Kosminski, who was a Polish barber and a prime suspect at the time, using DNA evidence from a stained silk shawl found near victim Catherine Eddowes. The study compared mitochondrial DNA from the shawl to living relatives of both Kosminski and Eddowes, allegedly confirming a match, but critics have argued against the findings and they found it unreliable. And so we're actually going to get into those cases, but first let's get some background on some of, what exactly happened, at least in terms of this, in case it's been a while since you've, read about this stuff. Essentially, there's these people, or there's 5 victims known as the Canonical Five, okay? And so these people are known as Mary Ann Nichols, and she died on August 31st. There was Annie Chapman, who died on September 8th. And there's Elizabeth Stride, who died September 30th. Again, Catherine Eddowes, who also died September 30th. And there's Mary Jane Kelly, who was also killed on November the 9th. At least, that's what we have so far. And so essentially, the common thread as how the police would tie these murders together is that, well, there was, of course, the location that they were killed in, which was in Whitechapel, London. There was also some particular throat slashes. There was also mutilation. And then, of course, there was an escalation of violence. And actually, the matter of fact is that the last victim, ended up being the most disconfigured, or at least, most messed up when it came to that. And, of course, there was organ removal, and there was lacks of witnesses. And, of course, it was just one weapon, a very sharp knife. At least, that's what we know so far. And so now, we're going to go into the primary suspects. At least, this is according to police records. There's been so many different people that have been theorized about who the Ripper is. But we're just going to go off of what the investigators of the time were thinking. So you have, of course, our first person, Aaron Kosminski. You have Montag John Dritt, Michael Ostrog, John Pizer, and George Chapman. Okay. So these people all have very particular records and very different, reasonings for being tied to the case. But we're going to look at Aaron Kosminski because that is the subject of, well, what the discovery actually was. So now we're going to go into some of his early life and see what we can find about him. So let's look into some of his, let's look into a very brief biography about him. Aaron Kosminski was born in Poland in 1865, and he was actually a barber in Whitechapel, London, hence why he was a suspect. And he was moved to England in 1882, and he was about roughly 17 years old. And a very key note was that he had a very big decline in his mental health, and he also had violent tendencies, which he threatened his sister's life with a knife, and he has particularly a documented hatred against women. And so he was institutionalized in the Mile End Old Town Workhouse in 1890 and 1891, and then he went to Middlesex County Lunatic Asylum in 1891, and he was then proceeded to be moved to Leavesden Asylum in 1894, where he would then pass away on March 24th, 1919, after years of severe mental deterioration. So some symptoms that he had was that he believed he was being controlled by an external force. He ate from gutters, refused food from others, suffered from auditory hallucinations, and he spoke mainly German and refused to work. And so the reason why these is particularly relevant is just because he also lived in Whitechapel during the 1888 murders, and he was suspected by the police at the time. And he was institutionalized soon after the last confirmed Ripper murder, and of course DNA from the crime scene shawl was claimed to match his genetic profile. But you'll see why it's going to get controversial in a bit, because you hear that, okay, there's a crime shawl, there's DNA on it, okay, we can probably trace and all that. But I'm actually going to link you to 2 studies, and these are actually, well, the second study is going to be the one that was referenced in accordance to the discovery of Jack the Ripper. And so, looking into the 2014 study, so What I have here is that on September 7th, 2014, Jari Luhalian, an expert in historic DNA analysis, announced that he had extracted mitochondrial DNA from a shawl said to have been found with victim Catherine Eddowes. The mtDNA reportedly matched female line descendants of Eddowes and Kosminski's sister. In naming Jack the Ripper, Russell Edwards claimed that the DNA evidence definitely proved Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, stating, "I've got the only piece of forensic evidence in the whole history of the case." And it sounds very convincing. It sounds like it's actually, it sounds definitive. It's like, okay, we can wrap up this case and we're done. We got ourselves our man. However, there's some considerations that I'm going to make you keep in mind as we go through this case. One, this is something that happened literally over a century ago. So you can imagine that DNA evidence is very hard to come by. And of course, if you look at investigation at the time as well, it was also very tough to find this person. There's also some very weird evidence that was going around. There was also hundreds of faux letters, or basically letters that were going nowhere. And so basically this case was a giant mess. And so DNA evidence or DNA or forensics didn't really come into much effect until later in the 20th century. So just keep that in mind as we're going along. And also, the author of this book, Russell Edwards, also had his own, people found his evidence that he presented was very flimsy along with this 2014 study that's been referenced. So I'm going to take a little snippet here of what we have right here. And so here's a bit of a book review on his piece. And it says here, as a centerpiece to the argument, the shawl itself is problematic. Even a DNA sample recovered from a crime scene today that has been contaminated is inadmissible in a criminal case. This shawl is so old and has passed through so many hands that even though it's a very interesting piece of the puzzle, I can't completely buy into it. He does a very comprehensive job detailing its history and possible origins, though, which is worth reading even if there is reasonable doubt. Edwards was able to change my mind about one thing, and that had nothing to do with DNA evidence, and that was Kosminski's viability as a suspect. My main objection was the Sugden-colored view of Kosminski as a catatonic during his time in the Stepney and Leavesden asylums. Edwards, however, includes excerpts from records of Kosminski's stay at Colney Hatch Asylum, later Leavesden Asylum, where he later died, 1893, January 18th, chronic mania, intelligence impaired, at times noisy, excited and incoherent, unoccupied habits, clearly health fair. Warden, I believe, Seward. So, as you can see here, that was actually the main contention around this, that the evidence is very flimsy and it's only one specific piece of evidence. And as you know, crime scenes can get contaminated very easily. So that's why in every single one of your cop shows, you'll see that you'll have, the yellow line so that nobody can touch the integrity of the crime scene. Because even just the slightest of tampering can also make stuff very flimsy at best. And so, just some criticism that was present of the study in particular was that, first of all, there was Professor Alec Jeffreys, who was the inventor of DNA fingerprinting, and he actually commented that the claim was an interesting but remarkable finding that required peer review and a detailed analysis of the shawl's provenance. So, mind you, when you're ever doing a study, peer reviewing is very important because, somebody who's also an expert in your field can go through this and, follow your logic so that anybody else can, get an idea. Or at least make sure there's some validity to it. And then you have forensic experts later pointed out an error in the DNA nomenclature, a sequence variation described as 314.1C was actually the common variation of 315.1C, which is found in over 99% of Europeans, significantly weakening the claim. And mitochondrial DNA expert Peter Gill criticized the evidence, noting that the shawl's origins were dubious and that it had been handled by so many people over the years, making contamination very likely. So as you can see here, this 2014 study that has actually been referenced is not very strong when it comes to this whole Jack the Ripper mystery and who he is, because that is, of course, the big question. Who was he? Because the police couldn't catch him at the time, and now he is long since, passed on, so we don't know exactly who it could be. So this shawl was a lead, but then all of a sudden, your one lead is looking very flimsy at best, especially with how much it's been passed over and probably how many contaminations have been in. It's definitely not admissible in court, at least from my understanding. And so now, I want to take a look at the actual study that has been, referenced over and over again, and which really caused the major headlines to be talking about how it's been discovered. So, of course, this study was done in, 2019, and this is talking about, analysis of the Schall again. And this time, the article has been peer-reviewed, so naturally, it has a bit more validity to it. At least people have also looked at it and also have criticized the work as well. But we're just going to read some snippets to understand how we get to where we got to. There's going to be some, what you call it in English? Jargon, I think it's the word. That's really what we're going to be looking at anyway. So we're just going to look at how they did it and what was done, and then we can, talk about it. So here we have the methodology, which is samples and sampling method. So it says here, after initial optimization attempts, the final sampling was performed with a two-step procedure. The contaminated surface material was removed from stained areas using the double swab method, as described in reference number 4. The actual sampling for DNA analysis was performed from the pre-treated stains using a vacuum method by means of an automated pipette with a modified tip and small 20 to 40 microliters volume of standard phosphate buffered saline with added sodium chloride to release the material bound inside the fabric. And I'm also just going to jump to the sampling and DNA isolation, because that was also a very big point of contention. It says here, the samples obtained from the Schall were stored in negative 80 degrees Celsius prior to the analysis to minimize further biological degradation. For the forensic stains suspected originated from the victim, either a direct PCR or Qiagen DNA investigator kit was used with the manufacturer's protocol, Qiagen, Hilden, Germany. The reference samples were obtained from the current owner of the item, laboratory personnel working on the Schall from maternal descendants of the victim and suspect. Prior to this, all participants had received and signed informed consent forms, and the study was approved by the LJMU Ethical Committee, valid until March 31st, 2019. So, as you can see here, very detailed stuff on the methodology, but now we understand roughly how it works, give or take. And so now we're going to look at the examination itself. So here I have a visual inspection of the Schall, which is the most important part that we have to look at. So the evidence used for this study was originally obtained from a descendant of Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson, who was present at the murder scene of Catherine Edowis at the time her body was discovered. The evidence was loaned for research purposes by the current verified owner. During the loan, a full chain of custody was maintained with limited and secured access to the authors of this paper only. Routine forensic imaging methods were applied during the investigation of the Schall. Both parts of the Schall were photographed in sections using standard DSLR camera, and that's just all the rest of the equipment, and they used UV for corresponding filtering wavelengths, all that fun stuff. So essentially we have the method, and we actually understand that what is tied to the Schall, there's a good chance that it's possibly connected to Jack the Ripper. But keep in mind, like I said, whenever you read a study, it does not mean it's definitive. A study can enhance something, or it can also take away. So keep that in mind. But they also put in a conclusion over here. In summary, we present in this paper the most systematic and most advanced genetic analysis to date regarding the Jack the Ripper murders, and showed that the presence of mtDNA on the Schall matches the female victim's mtDNA derived from stains on it, and that mtDNA also on the Schall matches the suspect's the candidate's mtDNA. Furthermore, both are on the same piece of evidence and originate from specific forensically relevant stains that are in accordance with Jack the Ripper's modus operandi. That was a lot taken, but just to wrap up that particular section, we're going to just tell you that there was actually something administered, basically called an expression of concern, and apparently, according to the SJWDM 2013 guidelines, if samples have 2 or more nucleotide position differences, they can be excluded as coming from the same source or maternal lineage, except when heteroplasmy is encountered. There is no suggestion that heteroplasmy is present. The journal later printed an expression of concern after the study was criticized and the authors were unable to produce the original data. So as you can see here, looking at this, we don't really have a definitive answer because there's a lot wrong with the piece of evidence. And keep in mind that one single piece of evidence is never usually enough. And the fact that this Schall is so old also raises some questions where it's like, why would Jack the Ripper have a shawl, or was this just a client that left their shawl behind, or it got messy on the night worker prostitutes clothes. So a lot of questions around it, and that's where we really are with this case. So when I went looking through the stuff, I was like, hey, maybe this could be interesting. Take a little detour from the usual content, like what could be happening here. But for what I'm seeing here is that when you actually go through the study yourself, you see that there's some holes in here that don't make a lot of sense. You don't need to be a geneticist to realize there's some stuff that's a bit iffy. And of course, I could also link you guys the article below, but in order for me to access it, I had to actually, use a little magic trick. So besides that, you usually have to pay for this stuff. So anyways, that's where we are with that. So yeah, did Jack the Ripper mystery get solved? I'll actually let you decide that for yourself. Do you believe that this is actually somebody who did it? Is it Roman Polanski? Kowalski? I don't know why I can't pronounce his name. Do you believe that he's actually the murderer? Or do you believe that this is one of those mysteries that's forever going to be unsolved and just remain within the pop culture for times to come? Anyways, I would like your opinions on that stuff. But yeah, no. So when it comes to this, whenever you hear information, especially if you're a headline like "We found Jack the Ripper," take it with a pinch of salt, because when I heard that, I said, man, I'm gonna go digging into this. And it ended up turning out that this study, which has been heavily criticized, was being referenced when it came down to linking DNA and all that. So yeah. So I cannot say for certain whether it's true or false, but I'm just here to, take a look at stuff and maybe, get to know the information a bit better. But anyways, hopefully you found this video informative. I don't usually look at mysteries such as this, but perhaps I might add it to the catalog. Who knows? But with all that being said, if you enjoyed this type of deep dive, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and follow my socials down in the description below. But yeah, that's it for today, so ciao.